cloud. Here we go.
All right.
Okay. So now let me just go to this. Where did this share screen go? Here it is here. Okay, what we're trying to do here is to distill down, what we've covered in this class. So we've been doing iterations on this, trying to get it to come into sync. What I'm trying to figure out here is why doesn't this, hold on one sec. Here we go. Okay, so the idea for this class actually came about, I think in 2016, when I was running around on the web and I discovered this book by Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant called Occult Chemistry. And they had published this in 1908, but they'd made all of these observations through very deep meditation of the atomic structure of a whole series of elements. And they'd gone to different museums and just stared at these elements and were able to meditate and zoom down into the nuclear structure of these things, which was totally mind-boggling to me. I know I can't do it. So then I discovered that a physicist, Stephen Phillips, in the UK in the late 70s, had also discovered this and carried out a lot of analysis on their work, and discovered just a few little glitches, which were very understandable. And then I discovered that Ron Cowan had written some books on this topic. And so I contacted Ron in 2016.
Okay.
Okay, and the rest was history. So what we're going to do here is just try and include some of this background material so people are starting from a common place. We've changed what we're talking about here to metaphysics and meditation, okay? So you don't find the word religion in here anymore. It's gone. And this is where science, art, and mysticism meet. So that's what we've zeroed in on. So now let's just go through this and see. We're first going to cover what metaphysics is, so you understand why we changed it, and then we'll go into what Ron Cowan had observed, which actually confirmed the observations of Leadbeater and Besant, but went way beyond them. And then I'm going to also cover.
And who was that other guy?
What other guy?
That had in between them, he had.
There were before Leadbeater and Besant, there was a chap named Babbitt in the late 1870s. And there was another guy named John Wilford Keeley in the 1870s, 1880s, who had independently observed what we would today call quarks, using deep meditation. So Leadbeater and Besant were not the first ones. And in fact, what we're going to argue is there were probably lots of people over the millennia that had gone into deep meditation and zeroed down into the microcosm, but they had no framework to understand what it was they were observing. So the notion of having an atom that had a cloud of electrons around the nucleus, and that the nucleus was where most of the mass was. Remember the scaling here is that if we look at a typical atom, that's the size of, say, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, that the chalice on the altar is the size of the nucleus, and the cloud of electrons are the size of the basilica. So it's easy to get lost doing this. So then I'm going to go through a different way to go at this, complementary, that Dolores Cannon developed. And then we'll go through how we tried to put this stuff together. So that's what we're going to try and cover. So first of all, we go to metaphysics. And philosophy, which is the love of knowledge. Okay, so it's studying the fundamental natures of reality, or the first principles of being, identity and change, space and time, causality, necessity, and possibility. And I think, having seen this definition, that's really what we've been covering here, is metaphysics. So we're dealing with questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, between substance and attribute, and between potentiality and actuality. And so we're always looking at what there is and then what it is like, something like that. So this is metaphysics. So let's go back to the people that we just touched on. With Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant published this book with a lot of their observations. It's 500 pages or more. I have it in an Acrobat file, so I'll send it out so everyone can see it. But through this deep meditation, they both simultaneously would look in on an element and look at its cloud of electrons and its nucleus. And this was just at the point in time when, science, Western science, felt that materials, matter was made up of atoms as fundamental units, but they didn't know about the atoms having any structure to them. And that's what Leadbeater and Besant uncovered. And then they, in particular, there's a cloud of electrons around the nucleus, and the nucleus consists of these protons and neutrons that are the bulk of the mass of the atom. So each of the protons and neutrons is made up of entities called quarks. And in fact, Leadbeater and Besant looked at the quarks and saw they were made up of subquarks, and they called the subquarks universal physical atoms, or UPAs. And that was what they keyed on. Now, they also discovered isotopes of elements. So we mentioned, for example, hydrogen has one proton in its nucleus, but if you add one neutron to it, you end up with deuterium. But again, there's only one electron running around in the cloud around the nucleus, and tritium has two neutrons and one proton. So that's an example of two isotopes for hydrogen. The bulk of hydrogen is made up of just a single proton and a single electron. And one of the things that I have to point out here is Leadbeater and Besant never observed any dark matter. They only observed matter. And they did it in a way that was different than the way Ron Cowan observed it. When they looked at hydrogen, for example, they never looked at a single hydrogen atom. They looked at two hydrogen atoms. When they looked at helium, they always looked at two helium atoms. But they never saw anything that what Ron Cowan saw as dark matter. Ron called it mind forms and so forth. And they're made up of other types of subquarks. The subquarks that Leadbeater and Besant observed had 10 strings wrapped around them, which Ron Cowan observed. But the dark matter, the subquarks have only 5 strings wrapped around it. Another thing to keep in mind here is that we keep talking about matter and energy, but really there's only energy. When you talk about an electron, it happens to be a resonance of a lot of energy coming together to create something that we call an electron, or something that we call a proton or a neutron. Okay, but they're really all vibrations. They're all different frequencies of vibrating entities. That everything here that we're dealing with is really energetic. There's when you actually push on this, you'd find out that there's no real matter anywhere. There's just resonances that create things that we call matter.
It's more like an event or a behavior than a thing, right?
Right.
It's
But it happens
a happening.
Yeah, but it happens to be stable. Something like an electron is stable for, billions of years. So it's a coming together of energy. So we can treat it as something like a particle, but it's really vibrating the whole time. So the physicist we mentioned, Stephen Phillips, went through all of these observations that Leadbeater and Besant did and showed that statistically they were really right on the money, and wrote a paper on this, which Ron Collins saw. And Ron contacted Stephen and said that he had carried out observations of the same sort that Leadbeater and Besant did, and that he could confirm their observations, and he could in fact go beyond them. So Stephen Phillips came to Toronto. Bruce, you met him, right? You're muted.
Yeah. He's a very, very nice man.
Yeah, he came for what, a couple of weeks?
Yeah, he was, because he went into retreat with him. So him and Ron did all kinds of experiments.
Right. Well, so he was convinced that Ron was in fact duplicating and the things that Leadbeater and Besant had seen, and because Ron had seen more things, this was exciting. This was new things that they hadn't seen. Now, I mentioned
and Stephen Phillips is really into, I guess what we would call Western Kabbalah.
he's
In his sacred geometry site, he goes into tons and tons of amazing analogies and parallels between modern physics and Kabbalah that are because he's a physicist and somewhat of a Kabbalist. It's fascinating. And to me, it's fascinating because I was studying Kabbalah at the Theosophical Society in New York in the late 90s. And around, the turn of the millennium.
so
But I wasn't that into Annie Besant. I thought they were kind of nutty, to tell you the truth.
So quick question, when you reference or say Western Kabbalah, is there a Mideastern or Eastern that is distinctive?
Yes, the Hebrew Kabbalah is more esoteric. It's less it's less shared with the general population, and there's a lot more practice to it. There's a lot more unwritten oral tradition of practice that is usually very hidden from the non-Jewish world. The real keepers of the lineage are the Hasidim. And some are in Israel. Some have a whole feeling against Israel because the temple hasn't been rebuilt. So they think they shouldn't be there. But a lot of them are based in New York City.
Wait, something's got to get muted. Dad,
Yep, I'm trying my best.
hold on.
Hal? Okay. But so I was very blessed that my teacher came from the Western esoteric tradition, but also studied with a Hasidic rabbi. So he was getting the best of both. But he would always give us both sets of interpretation. But the strictly speaking Hebrew one was the more energetic and the more esoteric, the more hidden, and really the more spiritual. But they both work. But
So for
Keep
what
going.
it's worth, I'll just toss this out as an idea, but I would love to explore the differences between the two at some point in the future with the group, you know, in a presentation, because I hear what you're saying, but I've never heard the Kabbalah being described as two different ways of looking at it.
Oh, okay. There's one type that is the so-called Christian Kabbalah. They weren't really literally Christian. But that when you see Kabbalah spelled with a C, that's a group. And like the Masons fall into that category. The Freemasons are like all into Kabbalah.
Interesting. I've never seen Kabbalah spelled with a C.
Well, there's another
Okay.
side to this.
Or with the Q, and those are the more esoteric. But when it's with a K, that's your signal that that's really the traditional Hebrew and mostly Hasidic tradition. And they're pretty strict about who they teach it to. They really don't share it with even many Jewish women. It's mostly men over 40, you know, they have to be married. They have all these prescriptions about it. There are books, but they're really kind of useless without the oral instruction that goes with it. But that is a lot of what the Theosophists were really basing a lot of their work on was they call it occult chemistry. It was really Western Kabbalah.
There's another side to this, which is the Essenes. They were in Qumran, and that's where these scrolls were discovered. And the Essenes would be the most mystical of all of the sects of Judaism. And that appears to be where Jesus of Nazareth and John both studied there for a number of years to be exposed to this.
A lot of what Jesus says only makes sense. A lot of things, even from the Old Testament, only make sense in a Kabbalistic context. But a lot of the things that Jesus was saying, the aphorisms and so on, they come to life, in this whole other way. If he was a Kabbalist, he was a master Kabbalist. That was, I believe, where a lot of his deepest training was as an Essene. But he also apparently spent years in
India
and Tibet, especially.
Yeah. So the other thing for Stephen Phillips was that he noticed again this tie to the tree of life, which is a key element of the Kabbalah, and he worked on the geometry of this, in part because the Brits do a great job of educating people in geometry, if you want to. And so the end result of all this was he got carried away in this direction.
We should do a whole class on his website.
Yeah, well, his website is you can go look it up and you'll see. all of the stuff he has there
You
on
can
this.
spend months looking at it.
But there's certain things that he just got hung up on and missed other things. For example, anything related to dark matter, you can't find anything there on this. Okay. Then I just mentioned there were other people that actually published their papers that by a chap named Babbitt and John Keeley in the 1870s, 1880s, where they actually observed quarks. So they made sketches of quarks with these strings wrapped around them. And so it isn't simply, for example, Ron Cowan making this stuff up. There's a lot of other people that have done this. Now,
That's what I wanted us to establish, that he was, working in a framework, and there's a certain amount of objectivity to what he was.
yeah, the main thing that I pushed with Ron and working with him
discovering.
was to look at the arena, which I could see for the 3 dimensions of space and one of time. We're not going to do it for describing what was going on. And Ron could actually see these other dimensions in his own way by observing these things. Another side that Ron pushed on was actually looking down beyond the microcosm, the nucleus, going down to the actual compartments of space itself, the foam that makes up the space that we see around us, that is the 26 dimensions type of space compartments. And when he did this, then he discovered it was all covered with these information blocks, which we're going to get to. And that was, a huge discovery. It showed that everything was coordinated by this incredible algorithmic system throughout the entire universe. And so it goes. And that information, the information that's everywhere, is what I believe Jung would call the collective unconscious, that it underlies everything and you can sense it.
And it's what we've been talking about like the code.
Yeah.
It's the code that we think of in DNA, but it's in everything.
Yeah. And it's just hard to believe. This is a computer that has processing and memory that's so far beyond anything we could even conceive of. It's a joke. The one thing I put here at the bottom was with the whole really 20th century was spent in looking for these different particles, and the particles are really all resonances of energy, different types of energy that cluster together. And so you've ended up with 200 plus types of these particles, but they're all following a pattern which is based on what we call these octonions, which underlie everything. And so we'll come back to that as well. But the thing that physics focused on was the particles, and they didn't focus on the arena that the particles were in. Then they started to realize their problem, in the last 50 years.
Well, and they're really just starting to think about the space.
No, they're
much
thinking
more.
about it like crazy. Don't worry.
Yeah.
When you have this many high-powered PhDs with time on their hands, wanting to get a Nobel Prize, don't worry. They're working night and day.
Well, my Kabbalah teacher, his spiritual master was a Buddhist master, one of the ones they call the crazy wisdom tradition. And he always said that the Buddhists and Kabbalists have a very similar way of looking at space. And that it's full, it's not empty.
Yeah, space. We'll get to this, but space. There's a lot more to empty space
Right.
than you would think. So Ron focused on what was called micro-psi, but he also was able to go out in between the stars, between the galaxies, and make observations out there. And then the one thing that I left off here was he was able to go back in time, back to the big bounce that created the universe that we're in right now. And that led him to see you know, for example, we talked about inflation, and you could actually see the space compartments inflating. They're just rapidly expanding at you know, orders of magnitude in incredibly short periods of time, and so forth. So he had capabilities far beyond what Leadbeater and Besant had shown, but he also, you know, came up with this notion of having 26 real dimensions here, and that being the actual arena, the sacred geometry of the universe here, which we've gone into. And then he looked at matter, and he could also see dark matter. He called it shadow matter or transparent matter. The point is, it's not matter. So matter is made up of these subquarks that have these 10 vibrating strings that are all closed
You need
around
some
them.
illustrations.
Yeah, I'm going to put that's what I'm going to do in the next iteration. Whereas the dark matter only has 5 of these vibrating strings running around it, and the subquarks for the dark matter have no charge. There's no electrical charge. In fact, there's no electron in the dark matter subspace. It's only in ours. And then the notion of information here that makes up this collective unconsciousness and governs how everything behaves is really, you know, a huge accomplishment. It's always scanning, and trying to detect changes. And when it detects changes, then it acts on it according to the algorithms that are there.
Which is what we see in the double slit experiment.
Right, exactly. And here at the very bottom, I just put in some of the cosmology he'd done with this big bounce here. So these are, any one of these things are huge. Now, I touched on this before as a complementary way to look at this, with this notion that Dolores Cannon came up with of hypnotizing someone very deeply, so that the what we would call the conscious side of things is just tuned out, it's gone, and you're linked directly to the what she would call the soul that's incarnated with the body there. And this particular person who's been hypnotized by her typically has some sort of medical issue. So she asks, now that the person is under deep hypnosis, could you go back to a past life that's particularly important in your medical condition? She just asks, and typically will be taken to one of these earlier lives that the person has incarnated in, and that will reveal some clues as to what the problem is, why they have a backache, or why they have a left shoulder pain, or you know, anything you could think of. And she's done this, you know, time and again with thousands upon thousands of people. And so effectively, this is a different way to achieve, you know, very deep meditation, but through this somnambulistic hypnosis, so that you really are in deep meditation, but she's using it in a particular way to regress into past lives. Okay, now Ron Cowan actually did this as well. He was linked in an earlier life to a person named Emmy Noether, who's an absolutely world-class German mathematician. And when Einstein had troubles with general relativity, he went to Emmy Noether to help figure out what was going on. So that's the caliber person that she was, and that's who Ron was. But somehow Ron was able to carry her around with him, and he would talk to her all the time, and we would have these three-way conversations, which you know, they were. I didn't hear her talk, and he would just say, "Oh, she said this," and I would ask a question. He said, "No, that's a dumb question." Okay, so that happened a lot of times. Don't worry. So anyway, there's a whole series of things that she carried out here, many books and lots of YouTube videos and so forth that complement what Ron was doing, that suggest again that there's a soul there, that and what she argued was that you incarnate into a life to try and learn something, to progress, and that the progression is really something you can't do just being a soul. The incarnation allows you to experience things, but you have free will to go after these different things. And if you learn the lesson, then you can advance in the next lifetime to something else. Or you have people that fail it and they have to relive the life that they were just in, but maybe in a different role. Maybe they're the person being prosecuted rather than the prosecutor. You name it. So we have two different large bodies of knowledge here for talking about this. Dolores Cannon happened to just trademark her thing into quantum healing hypnosis. And if you go on the web, you'll see there's bunches of these people that are, close by. So you can, if you're interested, you might approach them about doing something.
That have been trained in this.
Yeah. So the thing to take away from this is that Ron did everything through deep meditation and this awareness or enlightenment, but he focused on these special traits of looking down into the microcosm, the clairvoyance side of things. But it was more than clairvoyance, because he was able to actually manipulate things like electrons or protons or gravitons or whatever. So he was able to affect, just from his mind, having forces that would stop something from moving around, and he could examine it. That's how he made the sketches he did of these subquarks with the strings wrapped around them. Whereas Dolores Cannon, again, simply was a passive observer. And so she would ask questions, she would hypnotize the person and ask questions, but she would never try and lead them in some direction. She would just let them talk through what their previous life was like, and then ask why was this particular life chosen. And typically this unconscious side of things would kick in and would tell her directly that you were showing this life because this was a lesson that had to be learned, and it was only partly learned in that life, and now it's being dealt with in the life that this person is in right now. So in both cases, there appears to be a soul that is there to learn and to grow in this lifetime in a way that couldn't be done otherwise, and then the process repeats. You incarnate again and again.
It seems to also depend on forgetting.
As soon as you incarnate, the agreement that you made where you're going to work on these things, you forget the agreement. So it's called the veil, the Maya that comes down, and you have free will to go pursue what's going on, and hopefully you'll make the right choices so that you will not end up having to relive this life by not learning this lesson.
But if you just stay in the oneness, when you're that undeveloped, you won't develop.
Right.
Is the thinking, is the teaching.
Right.
That you need the experience, and so in some ways you need the experience of separation to have the lessons that you need. You can't do that just when you're submerged in the oneness.
One of the things that came up with Dolores Cannon was that once you could identify what the issue was with your body by itself knows what good health is. And so by linking yourself to this source of knowledge, you could channel this knowledge in and energize your body to go back and heal itself. And for example, you could cure scoliosis, you could cure cancer. She had lots of examples of people doing things that were like impossible. One person had a brain, water on the brain that was covering like a whole half of the brain cavity, and it entirely went away, and within a month was gone. And the doctors couldn't believe it. Once she realized that what the issue was, and that she had the wherewithal for her to do it. If you don't believe you can cure yourself, then you're not. It's not going to happen. But this is one of the things that came out of these activities. So then this took us back over to looking at what I call the classical versus a discrete or quantum view of things. So the classical view of matter and energy and space-time came about first. And this is when we look around us, we see earth, air, water, fire, and the Akashic side of things, the Akasha means ether. So the ether supports the earth, air, water, and fire. And this is your Akashic record that's kicking in, doing this stuff. It's caught up in the ether. And then when we progress through people like Newton or Mendeleev with these periodic table of elements, or anything that you could think of there, everything led to matter and space and time being continuous, and it could be subdivided as much as you wanted. And that turns out to be false, that there actually are fundamental units. We go back to Democritus, who said that all matter was made up of atoms, and those are the smallest units. He didn't realize that atoms themselves might have smaller components. But there was a lot of activity with electromagnetism in the 1880s, 1890s, especially Nikola Tesla, where they were trying to find this ether and could not find it. And that took them away from thinking about anything being discrete or being quantized until we get into the 20th century, and we had observations of things like light being discrete particles called photons. So the photons by themselves, when you get enough photons together, what looks like a continuous wave of light, a light at a particular set of frequencies, for example. But deep down, the light is very discrete. It's made up of these particles called photons. But if we take it the other extreme, and when we look at space itself, then space itself is quantized, and it's basically a foam. There's these discrete compartments that make up space, and then we get enough of them together. As far as we're concerned, it looks like a continuous space around us. And the things that we deal with for matter, these particles, can only move from compartment to compartment, and that is how things work, and that's the fundamental view of everything. Now the thing to keep in mind in all of this is, which one is useful for you. The most basic one is really the discrete or the quantum one, but it might not be that useful to be able to carry out calculations of any sort or predict things. And sometimes the classical view is a lot easier to go work with. So just something to keep in mind. But one of the things that comes out of this is the fact that space is quantized. So if space is quantized, the one thing you learn from quantum theory is that everything is always vibrating. So even though you take it down to what you think of as absolute zero in temperature, it's still vibrating. The compartment of space is still vibrating. And this is called its fundamental or lowest level of energy. It's called the 0 point energy because you can't go any lower than this. And what's interesting to me about this is that this is intrinsic to the space around us. And I'm starting to see people propose power sources where they would build a resonator, typically of some sort of crystal, that would be able to resonate with this 0 point energy and therefore produce electricity without any, if you will, without any fuel, because the 0 point energy is always there. There's a huge amount of it. In fact, more than we could ever possibly use, and it's not going to cause any pollution. So this is a totally unexpected consequence of having something that's a totally discrete, is that you can actually have access to an incredible source of energy. Now, the next thing that Ron did was he started looking at the walls of these space compartments and discovered, if we go down to the top left figure here, he saw these blocks of what he called information. And when he zeroed in on those blocks of information, he saw that they weren't really blocks, they were really stacks. They looked like a block conceptually, but when you zeroed in, there's a whole stack of bits here of different sorts, and that this included both the algorithms and the data that was being sensed in the world all around you. And then he looked on the surface of one of these slices, and he saw what he thought was a snake, but it actually was a wave of some sort. And there's other waves. Here's a more complex wave that he saw. And this is therefore how this computer is actually running things. It's sending these signals around, and so it goes. And of course, we're not going to figure out how this works. We're going to have to get a lot more work on this to figure out what's going on here. But the information that's here, remember, is actually controlling all of the forces and fields and particles that are all around us. So if you can in fact get in there to go lever this in some way, then you can float in the air, you can walk through walls, you name it, you can do it. So that was the first thing that Ron observed. And the thing to take away from this was there's a mental or a metaphysical side to the human body, where we have a conscious mind and then this unconscious mind that appears to be linked to this collective unconsciousness that's all around us. And remember, the collective unconsciousness is also not simply in the space around us, it's in the rocks, it's in the plants, it's in the animals, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in everything that you see around you. So it really is a collective unconsciousness that's just everywhere. And this also ends up creating this in quantum mechanics. It's called the universal wave function, the wave function of the entire universe. So everything is embodied in this. All possibilities that are here are embodied in this. And the question is, which one of these paths will you actually take to go anywhere? Which is going to be the true reality, and which one is going to be a reality, a path that you didn't take. So the thing to keep in mind here is this non-duality here. It's really allowing you to sense this universal wave function, this fact that everything is encompassed in what's around you, and metaphysically you can link to this, and that leads to the loss of duality, the loss of having a conscious mind, and actually being aware, or being truly enlightened here. So we use this picture again and again of the conscious mind is like a person, and they're to achieve non-duality, you step back from the movie that you're in, and the movie's in 3 dimensions, the 3 dimensions that you see around you, spatial dimensions. But when you step back, you're stepping back into the other, into the entire 24 spatial dimensions and 2 time dimensions, 26-dimensional space total, and you're looking at the 3-dimension movie that's what you think of as life. And when you look at it this way, you realize that again, that what's really going on is in the space all around you, and not simply in the 3 dimensions that people get caught up in, and they think of that as life. Another thing that came out of this, especially with Dolores Cannon, was reincarnation. So these souls that are immortal, that live forever, incarnate into different forms again and again. So people, in part because we have so many trillions of years of this universe, we can incarnate into rocks for a while, or into water, or into a tree, or into a flower, or an ant colony, or an elephant. And so you get exposed to all these different things along the way, which increases your awareness, but it also implicitly makes you more tolerant of all these different things, that you want to protect them, that they're all sacred, that they're all very full of life. This collective unconsciousness is everywhere, and you should not be intolerant just because they're different, just because there's something else that's going on. So when the body dies, the soul releases from it and goes through a review of this past life to see what the lessons were learned or not learned, everything. And the end result is, this suggests what you should do in your next go around. So you should identify what new lessons you have to deal with. What new things you have to go through? Did you not do things correctly? You have to repeat things, all of this, and then you go ahead and incarnate again. But eventually you're driving toward higher and higher levels of awareness or enlightenment over time. So we touched on this veil of forgiveness, forgetfulness, that you once you incarnate, you don't remember what the contract was that you signed up for. What is it you're supposed to learn in this life? That's part of the deal. But another side to this is that there's nothing to be feared from death, because the soul will live forever and has the knowledge of all of these past lives and lessons. And this is really what you're trying to do, is to elevate the soul in its awareness and its enlightenment to higher and higher levels of love and compassion. Here's where we touched on the quantum mechanics side of things. And this
Why don't we see if anybody has any questions or comments?
Yeah, let's stop. Questions.
For a second.
Oh, everyone's muted. Unmute.
I've unmuted, but I don't have questions.
Or any comments or anything that you want to say, or?
No, the only thing actually came from earlier statements regarding coming back in, going through Maya and being forgetful of the lessons you need to learn. And it just struck me that one, there are lessons that need to be learned. So you're being sent back on, or you're sending yourself back on a relearning mission. There's no way of avoiding learning those lessons, because the intent is that you learn them finally, one way or another. Your responses may be different, but you will continue to be presented with choices regarding the lesson that you're supposed to learn. You can't avoid the learning. That's the thought that you can stay kind of at one and not relearn the lesson, or somehow make the right choice and avoid the harshness of the lesson, doesn't ring true to me. I think that you actually have to relearn the lesson if that's the purpose in coming back. I'd love to hear from anybody else who disagrees with me.
No, that's what Dolores Cannon said again and again, was that if you didn't learn it, you had to go relearn that lesson in another life. And you might do it many times till you finally got it right.
Yeah, so there's no
You
way
don't
to
have
really
to learn it, but you
avoid
can
relearning it or learning it.
Right. Yeah, but you may or may not learn it in a given lifetime,
Right.
but the thought is that you have to come back and do it again, and until you eventually do, and it's supposedly it doesn't get easier, it gets harder.
Yeah. And did she talk at all about categories of lessons that needed to be learned for
No,
spiritual growth?
yeah, no, the categories were basically, I would put it this way, that we're still very primitive in our notion of getting toward enlightenment, and I sense that there's many higher levels far beyond what we can even conceive of. Okay, so all of the stuff that Dolores Cannon dealt with was very, I'll just say, mundane. You had to learn to help people to heal themselves, so you would teach them to heal themselves. And so in this lifetime you're a nurse, and in an earlier lifetime you were a shaman, and so forth. But that's, I view that as the tip of the iceberg. That
There seems to be a recurring theme of love, that it's how you're relating that's the most important thing in this lifetime.
And compassion, and love for yourself, and love for your
And that
neighbor.
includes yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's and again, that appears to be on many levels, much deeper than any, than what you would think of as love in this lifetime. The love you're talking about is far more intense and vivid and really beyond description. Bruce, what would you say?
Well, in some ways, it's a bit more crude, is my experience and what I've learned from being some great teachers, is that, in a sense, wisdom is sort of learned the hard way. When you go into the bardo, unless you encounter meditation master or something like that, you can be just as lost as you are when you're alive. The main thread is that when you have especially a human being who has volition based on ignorance, like, for example, killing, for example, that's the kind of one that's the most vivid. It leaves a pattern in the mind that is very kind of quite solid, and goes into the next lifetime. In other words, it has a momentum that sometimes takes several lifetimes to get past, but it can also get worse. Like, for example, Putin is a very good example. where his consciousness got into killing. And over a number of lifetimes, he's got a lot worse. And now he's living lifetimes of where he's causing a lot of pain and suffering. But eventually that mind finds out, in his case, the hard way, that it just increases his own suffering. And the souls that acquire some wisdom gradually pull themselves out of those difficult places and start evolving. And it's it's basically kind of the universal thing of most human beings. Most human beings are about being reasonable and reasonably kind to each other. Well, what happens is that as a soul finds out more wisdom and more understanding, it expands and learns to go deeper. And that's kind of like the path to awakening. But there's a lot of beings who are just kind of lost. But nonetheless, they are still learning every lifetime something more. So it's a kind of a much broader understanding of unfoldment. And a lot of it is not all that great, because people make mistakes, especially when it comes to some serious like killing. But the main idea is that there's momentum of difficult karma. And the wisdom component is actually a deeper part of the mind that is not subject to difficult or volition based on ignorance. And so then you start encountering beings who are very ancient and have been around for a very long time. And they're in a sense born that way. They have transcended all the causes of suffering and so on. And they become great teachers. And when you encounter beings like that, like the Dalai Lama, for example, Christ would have been that way. The Buddha was, obviously. And these great beings are very capable of helping thousands and thousands of people all at the same time. So that's kind of the Buddhist view of sort of unfolding consciousness that everyone is involved in. And it can be quite different kind of experience than what most people would expect. As a matter of fact, it usually is.
And
So it's not I don't really see it as a collective unconscious, because when you get into the deeper levels of the mind, the main experience between beings is kind of like a union. There's my own experience of it is kind of a heart union with everyone. But most people aren't aware of it that much. But actually most people are, because actually most people are kindly to each other for the most part. So the unfoldment of consciousness is like a universal movement of reality that is always, but has been unfolding forever, sort of idea. That's kind of my overview of the nature of consciousness.
I really like the teaching that what you're just saying touched upon, the idea that each person's devotion to their own unfolding helps everyone else as well. And I like that a lot, that the more we can each unfold ourselves, the more it benefits everybody.
Right, but that's actually the nature of the unfoldment. That, in a sense, it's more the reality as it actually really is. It's not contrived at all. There's a deeper level of the reality mind that is comprehensive of all that. But when you
Because-
get into the diluted mind, then it's much more diluted. And it's like many people have very morbid views of other people's minds. I mean, Putin is a good example. Like, it's just like he's really lost it, but he's also unfolding. In a sense, he's finding out the hard way. Because when he gets reborn again, it'll get worse for him because it caused so much suffering. So when you kind of like get insight into the nature of consciousness that way, it's quite inspiring, and certainly not as negative as one would think. And you know, things like free will, and from that level of understanding doesn't exist. It's all kinds of interesting things that come from that. The unfoldment of consciousness is like a part of reality.
One of the reasons why I put in this many worlds interpretation of reality out of quantum mechanics was because it's a way to include free will. You end up having all the possible outcomes there are going to have some likelihood of occurring. Now, the reality is some of them, while they could occur, they're very, very rare, very unlikely, but they still could happen. So in some world, in some universe, whoever it is could have taken that path, okay? But then by the nature of this whole thing, you'd probably get tugged back onto whatever the mainstream path is, okay, because you went so far away from it. But this, you know, the thing that was intriguing to me about this was the guy who developed all this work. I actually read his doctoral dissertation, and he gave talks on this, and he got attacked so much that he just dropped out of physics entirely. He couldn't take it anymore. And it's sitting there, but I think there's something to this that it includes in this way the notion of free will. But you know, we'll see. This particular approach is completely consistent with modern quantum mechanics. It just is how it's interpreting the results. The calculations, the numbers don't change. So.
Yeah, well, the thing is that this is going back to Buddhist thought, is that you have the fully awakened mind, like the Buddha or Christ or somebody like that, and they see reality as it actually is. And then everything else is basically a conditioned mind and always has a cause. Like the way Putin is, it has a cause. It's not a part of the fully awakened mind. In other words, he's sort of lost in a kind of delusional state.
Right.
And he's going to be like that for many lifetimes because the karma is so severe.
Right. Right.
But if you get the fully awakened mind, like the Dalai Lama, for example, his wisdom is incredibly vast. And he actually directly in his own mind understands the cause of suffering. So it's, in other words, it's a difference between fully awakened and conditioned mind. And conditioned mind always has a cause. And this is kind of where the free will idea sort of falls apart. Because it's not free. They're not actually free.
Right.
They're
Right.
conditioned.
No, that's a good point, Bruce.
Well, we lost Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen had to go. He put something in the chat. You'll see it.
Oh, okay.
Um, the other thing that we came up with in doing this stuff was that time is basically different from these spatial dimensions, even though it's useful to deal with space-time as a four-dimensional space. The problem is that time by itself has this other crazy square root of -1 attached to it that makes you wonder, there's something different about time here. And the two examples we cited were when Dolores Cannon was doing this past life hypnotic regression. She found some students of Nostradamus, and Nostradamus realized that his students were interacting with Dolores Cannon in 1980. He's in 1530, and he starts talking through the student directly to Dolores at the same time, okay? And he asked her to go get his books and read them, and he'll explain to her what these different quatrains mean. And in particular, he said that the Pope would be assassinated, and she said, no, he was shot, but he wasn't assassinated. And he said, okay, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the Catholic Church is going to implode from within. That's that particular assassination didn't occur, but that doesn't mean the church isn't going to collapse. And a different example was dealing with people out of the South who felt that the South had won the Civil War, and in fact, that didn't occur. Someone got in there and changed things in time so that the South lost the Civil War, and so forth. So something funny with time is the only takeaway I want to leave you with here. That makes time special. But all of these things come back to people have to learn how to achieve awareness or enlightenment, and linking with this collective unconsciousness that underlies everything. And the reality is that there's different levels of love for themselves and their neighbors, and the compassion that they have for others, especially those that are doing things that you would view as evil or misguided. It's still essential to show compassion for them. That's one of the things, for example, when Jesus was with a woman who was viewed to be someone of ill repute, all these men came up and they were going to go stone her. And Jesus simply said, let the first person who has never sinned cast the first stone. And they looked at each other, and one by one they walked away because of what he said, that they themselves had made mistakes. And here this woman had apparently made a mistake, and she didn't deserve to be stoned to death. But it was the takeaway, to show the compassion for her. So in each life, you're trying to evolve to continue on this journey. But
Has anyone else ever seen this? Have you ever heard this? That the notion of sin is simply a state of separation from the divine. It's not this condemned behavior or actions. It's that you're not in unity, and you're in this state of not being whole, really. And they say the word whole is akin to the word for holy. That holy means being whole, and like integrity means being.
so what if you're a soldier and you end up killing somebody? Okay.
I think it's not the same. I don't think it's it's great, and we certainly have always had, you know, a history of conscientious objectors. But I think it's different from just wantonly doing it for your own personal reasons.
Right.
You know, if you're following
Yeah.
some kind of.
Well, you know, but
orders or
then let's do
a
it that
part
way.
of- A part of history,
Yeah, there are people though that are just, they go out and kill people.
right?
They're not soldiers, they have some intrinsic flaw,
Some compulsion,
yeah,
right?
Well, one of the perspectives I have about free will, basically it's an excuse to be judgmental. But if you actually look at the mind and how and why and how the person got into that place wherever they are, it's got nothing to do with free will at all. It's basically conditioned mind for over a number of lifetimes. So it's sort of like for me, free will is just wrong view. Doesn't fit.
Well, Jung felt that wherever there's judgment, there's projection.
Yeah, that's the problem with that. It's just always illusion. It has no reality at all.
Right, and it's all self-projection and self-judgment ultimately. Which even that is neither here nor there, because it's not reality.
Yeah.
But that the more strongly you're judging anybody else, the more sure you should be that it's a projection of some kind.
Yeah, that's the thing about it. Like love and compassion is not free will, for example. It's more
Right.
like how can you call love free will?
Well, it seems to me like a choice, you know, that I can choose to be more judgmental or less judgmental, or, you know.
Yeah, but do you actually choose?
I don't know.
Yeah, see, this is the problem. Like if you look at your mind and you see the previous conditioning over the last, say, half a dozen lifetimes, it's not that hard to figure out where a lot of those things come from.
But
And
how
it's
do you ever start to relinquish it then? I mean, that does seem to be part of growth. I mean, we look at that as spiritual growth.
Well, the fundamental view, for instance, in Buddhism, is that your nature, your mind, by its own nature, is already pure. In other words, the resources is already part of your own nature. I mean, it goes into the fundamental things that anyone can become a Buddha. And the reason that's the case is because that's the fundamental nature of your mind to begin with. And in a sense, what you're learning is not what not to do, in a way.
And you're kind of uncovering the natural state, you know, you're removing these.
Yeah, the natural state is already pure. You already have it as part of your consciousness.
But it seems to me there's some degree of choice in whether to keep covering that up with more crap.
Yeah, but you don't choose it.
Start to uncover it and you know, bring in more light is how I look at it.
Yeah, but you don't choose that.
You don't.
You know, what happens is that your own deeper wisdom mind expands and eventually gets there. It's not because you've chosen.
I see.
But what's hard to estimate is how powerful and how deep that deeper level of the mind is. Because
So
the
more
powerful,
you understand, or the more.
yeah, well, it's sort of more like in a sense in the deepest levels of reality, love and compassion are reality. They're already part of the natural mind.
Mhm.
So it's just a.
So it's uncovering that. It's uncovering the layers of,
No, it's like removing them.
yeah, removing layers of,
Uh,
yeah, removing layers of illusion and delusion and what, damage in a way, I think of it.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, that's kind of the Buddhist concept of emptiness. Basically, as you go deeper, the layers of various negativities and so on simply disappear. They just are, and as if they were never there in the first place. This is what happens when you get into much deeper meditation. But that's the nature of unfoldment. The nature of unfoldment is already reality. The mind is already unfolding.
Right.
Like
And I just add this thing at the bottom here where we have these teachers like the Buddha or Jesus, but they we can emulate them, but they've already achieved what it is that we're aspiring toward. And so, what is the path that we should take to go do what they did is really what the purpose of life is.
right.
And so then we went into meditation, and the rest of this is dealing with meditation. The only thing I added here was that we have these sacred geometry in 2 dimensions with these regular polygons, and in 3 dimensions with these platonic solids. And those are actually resonant. When you shoot energy into them, they vibrate, and the natural modes of vibration are contained by the shape of these things. So all of the that's what makes these things so powerful, is that they can amplify by resonating in these things. And just to give you some sizing for this to see, if we looked at the speed of sound in air, it's basically 1 foot per millisecond, 1,000th of a second. So if we're dealing with something that's kind of 10 feet across, then we're dealing with something like 100 hertz. On a musical scale, we have the what A is 440 hertz, for example, and 220 hertz is an octave below the A, and 110 hertz is below that, is another A. So that this is a base level A you'd be hearing here. Whereas if we deal with the speed of light, we have 1 foot per billionth of a second. So 10 feet leads us to 100 megahertz, and 100 megahertz is where FM radios run, or it's the very, very low end of any sort of radio communication for that people use. Okay, so that's the thing to keep in mind here is what sorts of frequencies are we dealing with by looking at the dimensions of these actual polygons and solids that are out there. And we end up with mixtures of these things when the dimensions are off a little bit, which leads to the possibility of having resonances, and things can constructively or destructively interfere. And what comes out of this then is the possibility to couple these things together to do truly amazing things. And there's all kinds of other games that happen here with things called wavelets that are special sorts of waves and so forth. So
And I just want to interject a note that we hope to come back to at some point. This is really the basis of Vedic astrology. It's all about harmonics, which are the shapes of the mathematical relationships of the planets to each other. And they work with progression. So not just the actual transits of the planets, but they work with all these mathematical projections that apparently are extremely accurate. I don't have that much.
yeah, we have to do some research on that to see, what's going on. So,
But they're based on the geometry and harmonics is
Yeah.
the point.
Yeah, one of the questions that Steve asked last time, I put in here, was we have this 26 dimensional space. So what things live in what dimensions? So the forces that we're talking about here, electromagnetism, meaning things like photons, they bounce around in all 26 dimensions. And there's a thing called the strong force, which is where opposites attract, is what we normally see, positive and negative attract, goes into opposites repel, which is which is why the nucleus ends up when we have two positive charges in a nucleus of an atom, they stick together. They don't repulse one another, they're actually attracted to one another. But that's why it's called strong force. And the other force, the weak force, is the one for radioactive decay, where a neutron turns into a proton and gives up an electron. And so these are all running around in all 26 dimensions, as is gravity. So the forces run around in all these 26 dimensions. It's what we call the particles, which are really the resonances of these energies. So we have matter is in one of these 10-dimensional subspaces, dark matter is in another totally separate 10-dimensional subspace. Okay, and that's what goes on here. And then the photons, which are particles that are actually electromagnetic, they bounce around in all 26 dimensions. So we have different realms for these different things to go work in. And so the reason why we need this geometry was simply because we have too much matter, too much energy that we can't account for. That, like I said, we only have 5% of it in the 3 dimensions of space that we live in. And so the other 95% has to be someplace else. And the simple idea is if we have 5% in 3 dimensions, then we need 60 dimensions, 60, to have all of the matter and energy that's out there. And that's we went a bit too high, but this leads to why we have dark matter, dark energy, and these things that are here. And then this leads to the arena that all these things are in. So that's really all I wanted to cover tonight. We didn't do anything more. Those are all the changes. And why don't we just call it an early night, and I will send out this deck, and I'm going to send out the Leadbeater and Besant book on occult chemistry. It's an Acrobat file, and so you can see what they wrote in 1908 and how timely it is. It's still, if you will, perfectly good. So anyway,
Thank you. That sounds great.
have a good weekend, everybody, and we will see you whenever next week.
Okay, next week.
Oh yeah, wait, I want to make sure too. You wanted us to cover what was it? You made a point.
Well, so at some point, if there, to delve a little further into the distinction between Western and Eastern
Kabbalah. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay.
Because I think, that just holds interest to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I go back to my comment, I've never seen Kabbalah spelt with a C. I've seen a K and a Q, but I've never seen a C. So
Well, look it up. Yeah, there's a Q, there's a C, and there's a K, and they're all slightly different.
yeah, and I'm most familiar with a K, so I will look it up.
Right. Now we'll take a look at it, see what we can do.
Okay,
Okay.
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Good night,
Have a
everybody.
good.
Have a good one.
Nighty.
Night.